Welcome to the Sellernomics podcast, where we share valuable tips and information in the Amazon and e-commerce space. Each week, we deliver the best interviews with some of the top Amazon personalities in the industry to help you grow your business. Today's episode is brought to you by Getita, the global leader in FBA auditing and reimbursements. Get $400 in free FBA reimbursements at getita.com/Sellernomics. And now, here are your hosts, Rob Stanley and Lisa Kinski.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to today's episode of Sellernomics. My name is Lisa Kinski. I am joined by my co-host, Rob Stanley. And today we have with us a guest calling in from sunny Jacksonville, Florida. We have Dillon Carter with Aura, and we're going to be talking about how to revolutionize Amazon repricing, how to build out your strategy, what's changing. So kind of an all-around crash course, if you will. So let's go on ahead and bring him on. Dillon, how are you?
Good. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
So first things first, for anybody who might be a newbie to either Amazon or repricing or just don't understand, what is repricing?
Yeah, great question. Funny enough, when I first got started as a seller a decade ago at this point, I didn't know either. And honestly, it's one of the most seemingly overwhelming things you get started with, although once you understand it, it's not that complex. Fundamentally, the way to view this is every slice of time, right? Every minute, every second, there is a optimal price at which you have the highest likelihood of getting a sale. So what a lot of sellers do is when they get started, obviously you want to save money. You're not spending a ton on software, right? You're just really ramping up your inventory. So what a lot of people do is they'll go through and just hit match buy box. That's like the go-to first version of repricing. Now, the issue with that though is things change. And even a year ago, things were changing by the minute. Now things are really changing by the second. So to put this in context, 82% roughly of sales are happening in the buy box. So if you want more sales, you probably need to be in the buy box more. Now that's a simplistic view, right? But at the end of the day, repricing, all we're doing is we're updating your prices in real time to make sure that you are best situated to either increase sales velocity, so sell more, or protect your profit. Those are the two things we kind of look at. Velocity and profit margin is kind of the two levers we tend to pull. So when you're getting started, a lot of people will list everything and say, great, that where I listed it is where I expect to sell it. The reality though, is that's rarely the case. You're rarely going to sell it where you list it. And a lot of people transitioning from a flipping model like the eBay world to Amazon, which is really volume and velocity based, have to make this transition to understanding that it's not just about where you expect it to go. It's understanding that the market's going to fluctuate time and time again, right? You're now dealing with a very different economics model is the way I like to look at this. I'm a finance major. So for me, it's every listing has its own unit economics, right? You have supply, you have demand. Did 50% more competitors come on the market on that particular listing? Well, now a lot of things have changed. So you really start to think about how is the demand changing? How is the supply changing? And then how fast is that occurring? And once you understand that level of speed and complexity, repricing starts to make a lot of sense because what you don't want to do is hold inventory too long, right? There's definitely an opportunity cost to holding inventory too long. One, just you could have sold it for half the ROI and spent it again at a much higher ROI 15 times in the same period it took you to sell it once. Or just long-term storage fees start to become a real thing. And so you need to be able to move inventory at a pace that makes sense. The issue is going in and pressing match buy box once a day is simply not enough. These are things that need to be occurring in real time. So what we do is we essentially watch for price change notifications, is what they're called via the API. We just watch. Every time a price changes, we go, great, we received that. Check your strategy and say, what should we respond with? We send that updated price and we keep on going. And we do that time and time again. In some cases, thousands of times per minute for each individual seller.
Yeah.
And Dillon, a question for you, just so everybody's kind of clear on this, kind of repricing. Who is that for? Is that a private label that they should be keeping an eye on? Is it retail arbitrage? Just kind of cover who, repricing.
Yeah.
Maybe it's everybody who sells on Amazon. Let's just clarify that for everybody.
Yeah, in a way it can be. We really focus in on resellers, right? So we're looking at RA, OA, and wholesale. Now on the PL side, on the brand owner side, you still have price optimization is really the language that's used there. So the difference there is for repricing, we're really looking at there's multiple competitors per SKU, per listing, right? And so like the way you're competing and the way repricing is modeled is very different than I'm a brand. No, I'm the only one on the listing, but I'm looking at this category. I'm looking at the elasticity, if you will, of this particular listing. So the way you're going to do price optimization for PL is very different than what I classify as repricing. Repricing, that language really lets you know we're talking about resellers for the most part.
Okay. That's super helpful because full transparency, the listeners know this. I've never been a seller and I've always just lived on the service provider side. And repricing is one of those things where I just said, that sounds too complex. I'm going to disbursements and never really took the time to understand. So that helps me really understand, okay, who actually needs this? What is it doing? Because in my mind, it was for everybody because I'm like, well, why wouldn't it make sense for a private label? But like you said, they're looking at a category as opposed to a reseller is looking at a very specific item, right? People go
Exactly.
they're generally not just browsing. They're looking for a thing. They want a specific thing and they're going to buy that thing. And you need to be able to beat out the competition for that thing. So that's super helpful. So for these, retail arbitrage, online arbitrage, these resellers, when should they implement getting a repricing tool? Because that's like a piece of software, right? As opposed to just manual pricing and listing. When should they implement something like this?
My thoughts on this have changed over the years. There's obviously a entry point cost, right? Where it makes sense. I think anything less than instant repricing is kind of irrelevant. So like, that kind of gets you to like $100 mark for the most part. So you kind of have to think about, you're in one of two camps. This is the kind of transition I've gone to. It's less about, back in the day, we would have said a number of listings or a specific amount of revenue. And what we used to say is if you're about $5,000 a month in revenue, you need to start looking for the market and figure out what makes sense for you, because things are going to start changing ideally very quickly for you. You should be growing. And for the record, what we tend to see is if somebody's going from no repricing to using a repricing tool, we tend to see a 40 to 60% increase in sales. If you're transitioning from one to another, it could be a 20 to 40% increase depending on what you're coming from and where you're going to. So like that really starts to have a compounding effect once you hit that 5K kind of range. Where my thoughts have changed on this is you're in one of two camps. Either it's already a problem, in which case you should have solved it a week ago. You should get it, right? You can already justify the price. You just haven't been doing it. Maybe you're putting it off because it is kind of overwhelming to get started with, although we could talk about why that's not the case and how long it actually takes to get up and running. It can be less than 10 minutes. Or you're in the camp of the investor. And what I mean by that is you have already figured out the baseline, the foundations of building this business, sourcing, you have products. Now you're like, you know what? I'm really wanting to turn this into something larger. I want to put fuel on the fire, so to speak. In that case, it may be worth it for you to get that sooner than later, right? So I'm always thinking about this in the sense of, is this something you should have already done? Or is this something you should do to enable you to grow at the pace you want to grow?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Dillon, one of the things I remember when I would do repricing, I was using a repricer tool. This was quite a few years back. But, it kind of felt like, and let's address what others probably are feeling. It kind of felt like a race to the bottom, on certain aspects, right? How low could you go before you're out beating somebody and still trying to make a razor thin margin?
Yeah.
Let's address that with everybody. Is there any strategies to basically when to say when or don't be involved in a race to the bottom? Help us out.
Totally. Yeah. I just wrote a blog post last week basically talking about price tanking, right? So when you first get started, one of the first terminologies you learn is penny chaser or price tanker, right? Not really a good thing to hear. I learned, I used to feel the exact same way before I got into the repricer software side of things. And I started to see a larger set of data and said, okay, well, actually, it's not that simple. You have to put this into perspective. Every seller is in a different life cycle of their inventory. What I mean is when you first come in stock, you tend to be very conservative. You care about profitability over sales velocity. As time goes on, you start to care a lot less about profitability and you're really trying to move it to get your capital back. What a lot of sellers do is they start conservative and they eventually find themselves, if you haven't sold that inventory fast enough, in a liquidation where you're like, just give me my capital back, even potentially losing money because it was a bad buy. That happens, right? So every time you jump onto a listing with other competitors, you have to understand that every single one of them is potentially in a different phase of that life cycle. So, and I've been this seller where I've held it too long. I'm moving it because now it's less that I'm tanking the listing. It's more I'm moving my inventory. So I think the perspective that a lot of sellers have when they see this is that's dumb. You're giving up profitability. Like, why would you do that? Well, there's actually a rational reason why you would do that in some cases, right? I'm not saying all, but there are times where you absolutely should do that. You should get your capital back because you're running a business. So, okay, you have that, but then you have to say, okay, well, let's start to talk about strategy and stuff like that, right? So we have the context here of how things work. If you want to get more sales, everybody that comes to a repricing tool, they want more sales and more profit. You can't really get both a lot of times because, supply and demand kind of thing, right? If I raise your dollar amount, are you going to get more sales or less? Probably less, right? But if I lower your price, are you going to get more sales or less? Probably more. So what we've historically recommended is something called an oscillation strategy. The oscillation just goes up and down. It's a wave. What we're trying to do here is trying to get the best of both worlds. So how do we get more sales velocity? Get in the buy box more. How do you get in the buy box more? You have a better offer. What's a better offer? Typically a lower offer. We can argue all day long about the ethics of that, but the reality is that's the model that Amazon has built. It's their house. We're playing by their rules. So if I just stopped there and said, do that, basically reprice below the buy box by a penny, and you said that's price tanking, I would say, yes, 1000%. But there's a second thing. Again, an oscillation also goes up, right? So we're going to increase our sales velocity by getting more percentage of the buy box. Then what we're going to do is once we reach our min price, we're actually going to reset to a max price. In doing so, you're actually increasing the average net profit per unit, or at least maintaining it. It seems counterintuitive. And I remember sitting down with, especially the early days, I personally onboarded the first 300 users of Aura when we first launched in 2018, forever ago. And we're really, collaborative. We work hand in hand with a lot of our users. And there are cases where we have done this strategy and walked the buy box up $5. It sounds counterintuitive. You're like, but you're lowering the price. Correct. But then I'm resetting it higher. So we actually had a case with a user where very competitive. They were really struggling, but we're like, well, if we can't really take more of the sales velocity here, could we manipulate it in such a way that we can at least increase the profitability you're getting? Because they didn't have a ton of units. Mm-hmm. So we did that. Every time we would go low, I would raise the max price by $1. When we went up, I would raise the min price by $1. And we literally walked it up $5. It took a few days because, speed kind of matters here, how competitive it is. So price tanking is a thing, but you have to pause and say, why would somebody rationally do that? And when should I rationally decide to do that as well? So there are times where you should do that. There are strategies that you build that kind of take advantage of essentially how Amazon works. Now, where a lot of people get stuck though, is they set their min prices too low and their max prices too high. This gap actually counterintuitively needs to be tighter. So what I've seen work really well is you base it on the buy box price. So the higher the buy box price, the wider that range can be. And the inverse is also true. So if we have a buy box of, let's say, $25, I probably don't want my min price at 20 and then my max at 32. It's actually pretty wide. Instead, what I would want to do is say, you know what? Buy box is at 25. I'm going to set my min to 23 and I'm going to set my max to 28. Now, a lot of sellers hear that and go, well, why wouldn't you set this way higher? Because if somebody's willing to pay me $60 for that, I'm willing to take that. Sounds lovely. But the reality is that rarely occurs, right? So by tightening these bounds, you have a higher probability of sellers when you jump to your max that they follow you. Either their repricing tool does this automatically or it's basic seller psychology, right? If we go down to 23, I go to 27 and you're in the buy box and winning, what are you going to do? You're going to go check all the competitors and you're probably going to raise your price because you're like, why am I going to sell at 23 if you're at 27, 28? I'm going to go up. Then we start this process all over again. So that's worked. I tend to say this works 80% of the cases. There's always exceptions. I wish there was one bullet, silver bullet that worked, but it's really 80% is what you're trying to get with that first strategy. Where things are changing though, and I think where the gaps have typically been is that max price. Because the reality is, I've already mentioned this, that like every listing has its own kind of economics, right? Things change and fluctuate very quickly. Max prices are really difficult. I've always said that your min price has everything to do with you and your costs. We would tend to recommend automatically setting that based on fees, ROI, your cost. Max prices have nothing to do with you. They have everything to do with the economics of that particular SKU at any given moment. The issue is the best way to do that historically is you manually set it. But let's talk about an interesting scenario where you're setting this for, let's say, a toy in Q3. Okay, that's probably fine in Q3, but what happens when you transition to Q4? Your max price probably should have gone up 30, 40, 60% in some cases, because let's call it a toy, right? So by manually setting this, you're really locking in and assuming that the economics of the attributes, whatever you want to call it, of that particular listing won't change. The reality is they change and can change seconds by seconds. So, transitioning over to like a dynamic max price, which is something like we've been exploring, which is like, how do you factor in more variability? So you're looking at, or more variables, right? So you're looking at things like, what was the last price the buy box was suppressed at? Factor that in. That's now a weighted thing. Is the market changing? Because now, again, my max price could go from, $30 to $60, and maybe that does actually make sense. So that's kind of how we tend to look at it. I know I just threw a lot there, so we can pause.
Yeah, if we could, because that is a lot to unpack, and we do need to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, but we will be back in just a second.
Today's episode is brought to you by Getida, the global leader in FBA auditing and reimbursements. Get $400 in free FBA reimbursements at Getida.com/Sellernomics.
All right, everybody, be sure to head over to Getida.com/Sellernomics for that first 400 in FBA reimbursements free. We are back with Dillon Carter with Aura talking about repricing. Just covered a lot of information, a lot about strategy, and you told the story about how you guys slowly inched up that buy box. Could you share maybe another success story or a case study where it positively impacted the seller's business? Do you have any real shining gems?
Yeah, I obviously a lot of this is private, so I can't share specifics, but and we highlight a lot of this because we're in a unique position where we even in our support channels, it's not just the bad stuff; it's the good stuff too. And one of the ones we highlight really on our landing page is somebody going from this being a side hustle to they're doing this full time. They quit their job and they have more time with their kids, right? Like sometimes, listen, I love the metric stuff where it's like, yeah, we increase we doubled your revenue. We've definitely have countless versions of that. But I kind of like the emotional side too, where it's like a lot of newer sellers are working towards this thing that's really difficult. And being able to have a positive impact and speeding up the time it takes them to get there is profound. So that's pretty awesome. There's some smaller wins, which is awesome using like AI, where this is public on Twitter, somebody getting a sale at $66 and then 30 minutes later getting a sale for that same product at $90. And they did nothing.
Wow.
We did that for them and they did nothing. So, you can go super meta with it. You can go really tactical and specific with it as well, but we tend to see things kind of all over the range.
Wow.
Yeah,
as the consumer of that product, if I bought it for the 90 and I saw somebody got it for 60, I'd be like, dang, but it is what it is.
You probably wouldn't have saw it though. That's
probably not. No,
exactly.
Yeah. Dillon, I do want to talk to you a little bit more about the technology, but before we do, kind of going back to the repricing, do factors like seller rating influence repricing strategies? Because, there's been times I go in and I'm like, I don't need to buy it from Amazon, or I could get it used or whatever. But then I go in there, I start looking at the list and you see somebody who's 98% rating and then another person is 100%. And there's a small difference. Maybe it's $1, a couple dollars, right? Like sometimes I'll go with the 100% person because I'm like, they got good feedback. I probably trust them more that the quality is going to be better. Any strategies kind of when it comes to that?
Yeah, it's kind of twofold.
Impact them? Yeah,
it can. It's kind of up to how the seller wants to approach it. So whenever you're creating a rule-based strategy, you have to define what the target is. And a lot of times we're not targeting a specific person. We're targeting a specific type of offer and then the competitor by default. So a good example here is let's say we're targeting the buy box. Whoever is there, that's what I care about. I can customize that and say, okay, well, if it's FBA, kind of reprice this way. If it's merchant fulfilled or Amazon, reprice these other ways. I can absolutely add exceptions and say, I really just want to ignore them if their rating is less than 80%. We can definitely do that. I like simplicity. This is overwhelming, right? When we say strategy, what we really mean is algorithm. And we're asking you to create it if we're going the rule-based route, right? AI is very different. But for me, I say find the most simple thing that works. And then let's now talk about the exceptional situations that we need to go build a really unique strategy to handle. So by targeting the buy box itself, I tend to say, I don't care what offer you are. I don't care your feedback. You're in the buy box and I want it. My theory and thought there is Amazon doesn't seem to care, right? So if you have worse feedback than me, but you're in the buy box, Amazon doesn't seem to care. And they're still giving you the thing that I want, right? So if you're going the route of, let's say you're targeting the lowest FBA offer, or you're targeting the lowest merchant fulfilled offer, that's when I would start to say, now we need to really consider kind of culling the herd, if you will, of the sellers we're willing to compete against. I tend to not recommend doing that if you're first getting started, right? Target the buy box, let's go there. And then if we need to get really hyper specific, we can definitely do that.
I would love to see the length of the NDA that the person signed who has all the secrets for Amazon. Because like it's all speculation, right? Like they care, they don't care. I'm just thinking like, who is that
changes.
person?
That's the hard part, right? And I think this really highlights our challenge is when people are like, how do I win? Depends. And unfortunately, I hate to say it depends because that sounds kind of, lazy, but the reality is every listing is different. Every competitor is different. All those combinations do change. And, on some listings, you can compete with Amazon and they'll let you win. Other ones, you can do whatever you want, but they're not giving it to you. And so this is why you really have to get that granular and think about how do we build something that can handle all those exceptional situations without having to have 15, 20 different rule-based strategies. And I think that really kind of highlights like where things are going. Because like for us, there's two major issues that sellers are dealing with right now. It's complexity and speed. Mm-hmm. Those are really difficult things to do.
Yeah. And especially with respect to speed, I love how you had mentioned at the beginning of the episode, having to really move that inventory, because we just kind of a natty plug. We just had Ephraim Ausch on from Tactical Logistic, and we were talking about the fee changes that are coming up and how it's really important. FBA is not a storage warehouse. It is a fulfillment center. You got to move your stuff, but it gets really complicated, right? When you're talking about, you have to have X number of days of inventory, but it's based off of your, 90 and last, just the math and the constant reevaluation of your business that goes on is exhausting. It makes my head spin. But speaking of changes that are coming down the pipe, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in terms of changing with the repricing game in general? Yeah. And then specifically, I think you had mentioned AI before. How is AI being implemented into this one facet of the Amazon business? It's touching everything, but what about this vertical?
It is. It is touching everything. I'm eternally optimistic. I feel like I got into Star Trek at a not too young age, but young enough age where it's like, this is really cool. And then, all these things are becoming real in my lifetime. So it's like, it's kind of bonkers. What is changing though? We're transitioning from a world of rigid automation to a world of reasoning and non-rigid automation. What does that even mean? If you look at something like Zapier.com or Make.com, although Zapier is doing some cool stuff with AI, so like give them a break. But these are really like rigid, like you say, if this happens, do that. And if anything happens not in what you told it, it will break. That's the rigid world. And like, that's awesome, right? Like I wrote a blog post in 2018, basically exploring like the future of being a seller. And like, that was my big thing, was like automation becomes prevalent and widely accessible to where you can automate a great deal. And while that is relatively true, what changed, especially last year, is that second version of this, where it can not be rigid, because if something comes in that feels exceptional, it can reason through that. And while that's great for large language models like ChatGPT, OpenAI, all that good stuff, how does that affect sellers from the context of this conversation? I already talked about the complexity. There are so many things that exist. If you just look at one listing, the amount of variables that are at play are plentiful, and they change moment by moment. right? Complexity and speed. We already talked about that. So we found that a lot of sellers, in terms of their behavior in using repricing tools, they create a bunch of different strategies. They're like, I always see these 8 scenarios. So I have 8 strategies to handle each one of those scenarios. And then their job is to say, great, let me go find all my listings and say, what scenario is this in, and apply the correct strategy. Okay, sounds lovely. You just created a task for yourself, which is not nearly as ideal. Instead, you need to take a step back and say, well, what if it's not the strategy? What if the strategy is not the solution here? What if instead we built a model that could understand those variables, and as they change itself, right? You're kind of taking that step back. It's kind of like the emergency fund analogy. Well, what emergency am I planning for? No idea. But can you plan for one? Yeah, it allows you to kind of be a little bit more flexible. And so what we've been really leaning into is that world where you say, well, it's not about creating a strategy. Honestly, like what needs to happen, repricing is very technically overwhelming if you want to get into the really nitty-gritty details of things. But how do we give sellers technical leverage? Meaning you get more out of it, more performance, more output, but you have to do and understand less. So if you look at like your regular rule-based strategies, those tend to have anywhere from 10 to I'd say about 20-ish settings that the user has to set. And if you change one, it contextually changes the other's behaviors, right? There's a lot of nuance there to a world where you have an AI where you can say, I only have one setting, but it handles far more scenarios than I could ever build, right? So it's less about having, plentiful amounts of AI strategies and really a model that can go in and do a few important things. It can study the competition, understand what they're going to do. Because if I understand what you're going to do, I can then basically theorize and say, well, if I do this, I know what you're going to do. I've already seen you do it. And we talked about that life cycle, right? That does change. So intentionally kind of relearning your competition over time. Just because you were, non-competitive and matching me a week ago doesn't mean you're going to be that way today. That does change. But also not just looking at the competition, but like having a desired outcome that it's optimized for, right? Whenever you're talking AI, it's like, what is the outcome that it's optimized for? So, we look at something called an optimal price. That's like a specific price, and that changes all the time, right? Like this kind of gets into that like elasticity kind of world. So it's really like, again, it's taking a step back, abstracting away the complexities and the craziness from the seller, but allowing them to have access to something that can handle those complexities at a fast moving space in a way that where what was true now could not be true in 10 minutes. And that's okay. That's that's like the world we're going towards. And I'm a big fan of like the whole like co-pilot kind of concept in the world. And I think, sellers will start to get these. I've been saying that a lot of sellers will go away from having sourcing virtual assistants and transition to having sourcing AI agents. It's going to be cheaper. You can spin up 30 overnight instead of having to hire 30 VAs, which takes time. And, there's a whole lot of stuff there. So you're about to get a lot of technical leverage without having to be technical yourself. And that's pretty impactful.
That feels, unless you have something else, Rob, that feels like a pretty natural transition into talking about Aura.
Yeah, let's do it.
So tell us about Aura. Who can you help? How do you guys operate? You said you've been around since 2018, so you've been around for a couple of years. You were a seller yourself. I'm sure that had a lot to do with the inception of the business, but just tell us all about you guys.
Yeah, so we launched in 2018. In the past year, we actually rewrote every line of code. We changed languages, everything. So like we relaunched, we call it the 1.0 system. And yeah, again, talking about this, what we've been talking about, right? Complexity and speed. Like we really wanted to handle these things. So we wanted to make these advanced functionalities available and accessible at like a price point that can scale to especially newer sellers. So when we set out to really rebuild Aura, we said, okay, well, there's a lot of things we just know we want to have like the same feature set, but there's things that are now possible. So we talked about AI. We call that Maven. That's our AI strategy model. That's accessible to any tier, which is awesome. But speed is its own thing, right? Maven doesn't necessarily handle speed, but speed, this is wonderful when you can pair it with Maven. So when you talk instant repricing, that actually means 1.5 to 2 minutes. Because in the software side, it is instant for us. We're not delaying at all. But when we submit that, 1.5 to 2 minutes before it comes back and it's confirmed live by Amazon. We found a way to do that with up to 50 SKUs. We can do that in less than 10 seconds. So we call this hyperdrive. So imagine you have an AI model handling complexities as things change in real time, and you can respond to those in less than 10 seconds. We're getting to a world where real time really matters, right? Like when we first launched, 15 minutes was like, oh, that's so fast. Now it's like 15 minutes. That's completely outdated. It needs to be as real time as possible. So that's what we set out to do when we relaunched. We've been getting some amazing feedback there. Those were like the two major features, as well as mobile support. I know it sounds like a simple thing, but there's not a lot of mobile support in our world. Being able to just do these things. I mean, for RA sellers, I've done RA. That's how I got started. It's kind of frustrating to have to wait to get home or pull out your laptop in your car when you're trying to like get things done, when you can just pull out your phone and get it done right then and there, right? Oh, yeah. So for us, there's definitely like that level of functionality, but also just like a really intuitive, amazing interface. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal until you use one. It's like Apple. Why are people obsessed with Apple? It's a great interface. It just makes sense. It's easy to use. So we put a lot of resources and time and effort into building that as well. We have a product designer on team full time. And, honestly, just the team, like we don't outsource anything. Everybody's in-house, support everything. And so for us, we're very consultative, very collaborative. We're always accessible. So if, I mentioned it is overwhelming when you first get started. What if it wasn't, right? Like, what if you could be up and running in 10 minutes and actively repricing? You can. And if you're somebody who needs more handholding, we can scale that with you, right? So you could jump in, never talk to us ever. Totally fine. You can be up and running in 5-10 minutes. If you're somebody who's a little overwhelmed and you need a little bit more, handholding, great. Let's schedule a personal onboarding call with you, and we'll actually sit down in your account, ask you a bunch of questions, get to understand the outcomes you want, and build things with you. So when you leave that, you understand the product and you're actively repricing. And our team, who really are experts in what we do, look that over and we're like, hey, you're in the best possible position here, from the jump. So for us, that's paramount.
And that's wonderful. We have a pretty similar, to toot our horns a little bit, we have a very similar layout to where it's either, hey, you can kind of drive this all completely on your own, or we're happy to walk you through the entire process. But I love the name of your tool, Maven. I don't know if everybody knows this, but the meaning of the name Maven is one who understands. It's also translated either into expert or connoisseur. So that's a really great name for the tool.
I will say we use AI to help name Maven. And I wanted something, because we were like, why Maven? I was like, you just answered it. That's why, right? Yeah. We wanted something that Maven highlights what it's designed to do, which is to understand. Mm-hmm. And, we're kind of geeky here, but, we want to highlight those things because fundamentally, like, that's what Maven is designed to do. It's designed to understand and respond correctly.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Nice.
Another example of, sorry, it just made me think of it. Wasn't it one of the PickFu founders who used PickFu to have people vote on what he was going to name his baby? People have used AI for more.
I love that.
Or used different tech. Awesome. Dillon, where can folks learn more about Aura and get a hold of you if they have any questions?
Yeah, goaura.com, GOAURA.com. We have a blue button in the bottom right. You can reach out to us at any time. If you're like, hey, I'm wanting to get started, but I'm not sure how, reach out, let us know. We're always here. We're readily available. But I would say that's the best place. We also host weekly office hours, Wednesdays at 2 p.m. EST. It's just goaura.com/office hours. It's an open session, kind of like in college, where it's just, we get to jump in, ask any questions you want. We don't care if you're a user or not. We just want to educate. So, I would say those are two great places to find us.
Awesome. And for anybody listening, Dillon is a Dillon, Dillon, not a Dylan Dillon. So it's Dillon at GoAura, GoAura.com. Website is just that, GoAura.com. Dillon, thank you so much for being on with us today and sharing all of this information. This is definitely like a second listen through, right? You covered so much about strategy, how things are changing. This is a repeat one, but thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And thank you so much to everybody who tuned in. If you guys liked what you heard today, please be sure to give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts with us in the comments, subscribe to the show, and we will see you on the next one.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Sellernomics podcast. Special thanks to our sponsor, Gatita. Did you know that Amazon probably owes you money for FBA reimbursements? Get $400 in free FBA reimbursements at gatita.com/Sellernomics. Be sure to join us again next week for more great tips on how to grow your business. And thanks again for listening.